Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Natasha. I am a professor at the Federal University of Jataí. Welcome to the panel Beginnings, Truths, and Lies, Narrative Paths in James, with professors Marcelo Pen and Luiza Larangeira da Silva Mello. And this panel is part of the third conference on Henry James and the first symposium on the study of realism and modernism. These events are organized by the Henry James Research Center, Brazil's first and only research group dedicated to the study of Henry James. We would like to express our thanks to the Department and Graduate Program in Literary Theory and Comparative Literature at the University of São Paulo, to the Brazilian Coordination for the Improvement of Higher Education Personnel, CAPES, and to the Laboratory for the Study of the Novel, LERO, for their generous technical support. I will now briefly introduce the speakers of this panel, and it's an honor to chair this session today, and it has been a pleasure to organize this event together with you. Marcelo Pen is a professor here in the Department of Literary Theory and Comparative Literature at FEFELESH, USP. He's a translator and literary critic and holds a PhD in literature from the University of São Paulo. He edited and translated The Art of the Novel, a collection of Henry James's critical prefaces, and also translated James's novel, The Ambassadors, as well as short stories and novellas by the same author. Marcelo Pen is the author of Realidade Possível, Dilemas da Ficção em Henry James e Machado de Assis. Luiza Larangeira da Silva Mello is a professor at the Institute of History at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and a permanent faculty member of the graduate program in social history. She holds a PhD from the graduate program in social history of culture at PUC-Rio. She served as editor-in-chief of Topoi, Revista de História, linked to the graduate program in social history and remains a member of its editorial board. So each speaker will have about 30 minutes for their talk, and afterwards we will open the floor for discussion. We will begin with Marcelo's presentation, entitled All About Henry, Memory and Beginnings in James's A Small Boy and Others. Thank you very much for your talk, Marcelo.
I must say yes, I forgot. I've changed the title a little bit because I was incurring, well, I didn't know that, but I forgot. A case of plagiarism. Henry James in the Darkest Abyss of Romance by William Goetz, and my title was something James in the Darkest Abyss, so I just that's a provisory, not final, And my paper is still, as I told Paul, not really complete. It's an open end. It's a work in progress, so I'll be glad to share with you and also to get any suggestions from you if you have any. And I can tell you when I finish it what I have in mind. Also, I was going to say something else. Yeah, I'm going to start with Ian Watt, as many here I think have João as well. Ian Watt, I think, is not our favorite author for, I don't know why. Yeah, it's not really, but good. Tá longe, né? How do... Okay. Thank you. So, Stratter's first question indeed. When Ian Watt was asked to do a piece of explanation for a conference, he chose the book he was beginning to read, The Ambassadors. Part of the difficulty of James' prose, why does James say it the way he does, asks Watt, resides in his dislike for the, I'm going to say, make this gesture, because there are lots of quotations, so I won't stop each one of them. Mere platitude of statement involved in homodiegetic narratives. His method implicates at least two minds, the characters, the way that they mentally digest whatever comes to them, and the narrators who interprets what's going on with these creatures. But of course, this act of interpretation aims at somebody within the inner circle of trust, the reader, with whom the narrator shares his bit of information, sometimes at the expense of the character. For such isolation, a more expository method is needed. No confusion of subject and object, as in first-person narration, but a narrator forcing the reader to pay attention to James' primary objective, Stratter's mental and subjective state. Without saying so, Watt introduced a fourth mind into the mix, James's. What happens then when we try to emulate Watt's explication de texte to another one of James's work, one in which the narrator is fully homodiegetic, even orthodiegetic, because he's the hero of the adventure being told, and that the hero is none other than a somewhat historical James as a young child in A Small Boy and Others. So, yes. We know it. There are some additions. We know it. It all began with the volume being about his brother, William, who had died 1 year before in 1910. As he wrote to Edith Wharton, William's death was to him an absolute mutilation. The whole project then initiated as a sort of homage to his brother, a collection of his letters with commentaries by Henry. And even if we get a bit of this intention in Notes of a Son and Brother, and also some of their father's writings, albeit all rewritten, edited, and transformed, the first volume is all about Henry. And so the title. From the position of a witness to his brother's beginning of life, the I soon emerges not as a close participant, but as the main character, reliving the treasure of spent experience and allegedly unable to assert discrimination as the comprehensive case declined mutilation. That's what James said. So James wants to keep the door to the past ajar. In his refusal to discriminate against the true terms and happy values, that is, to mutilate his text and the experience recovered by the memory which animates it, he seems to compensate for the mutilation represented by William's death. James would only have to put himself in relation with most of the aspects, using them for all it should be worth to do full justice to his subject. In doing so, he would feel the world within to compose with a grace of its own. Preserving a picture as it demands to be preserved is also doing justice to its beauty, and therefore to the beauty of the composition itself. So we must pause for a moment. After all, we are dealing with the same writer who just a few years ago, in the prefaces to the New York edition, discussed the looseness that the first person form in long pieces is foredoomed for him, making his characters at once hero and historian would be a romantic privilege amounting to the darkest abyss of romance. He also took pleasure in placing the subject of the ambassadors, for example, with as few words as possible in the center of the current in the second chapter of Book 5, and also pleasure in the Kabbalistic effect of the scheme in the awkward age, consisting of, again, a number of small rounds disposed at equal distances around a central object. So, in A Small Boy and Others, such restrictions and structural Kabbalahs seem less important compared to preserving and re-experiencing the past. Through the words of his amanuensis, Theodora Bosanquet, is that how we pronounce her surname? I'm not sure. We sense an air of embarrassment in that free, almost mediumistic flow. So, she says, for the volumes of memories, no preliminary work was needed.
A straight dive into the past brought to the surface treasure after treasure, a wealth of material which became embarrassing. It was extraordinarily easy for him to recover the past. He had always been sensitive to impressions, and his mind was stored with records of exposure. All he had to do was to render his sense of those records as adequately as he could. Each morning, after reading over the pages written the day before, and for those who don't know, this secretary, she wrote. James would dictate at first. So everything there from, I think, what Mason knew, or part of what Mason knew, all his works were dictated. So it's an oral, kind of an oral thing that's going on there. So he's talking to his secretary, and she's writing it, and then he would revise the next day. That's the way it goes. So I don't know. Which morning, after reading over the pages written the day before, he would settle down in a chair for an hour or so of conscious effort. Then, lifted on a rising tide of inspiration, he would get up and pace up and down the room, sounding out the periods in tones of resonant assurance. At such times, he was beyond reach of irrelevant sounds or sights. The only thing that would arrest his progress was the escape of the word he wanted to use. So, the past comes alive through words, but the words escape, hindering the process. Such escapades did confound some readers. I think one of the most eloquent ones would be Lee Clark Mitchell. His remarks are worth mentioning. The apparent failure to separate the perspective of the wizened narrator from his earlier self, whom he mirrors, produce, here quote, a gaping at the main memory of gaping. That symbiosis not only undermines the prospect of a transformed consciousness that had been the basis of James' novelist creation, but also challenges the nature of the genre, again, denying what autobiography otherwise affirms, that memories of a life can be shaped into a destiny, helping explain the artist James became. Richard Poirier, whom he cites, wouldn't disagree with him, even though he portrays the book in a much more positive light. He suggests reading the volumes as a work of fiction rather than an autobiography. In his drama of minds, belonging entirely to Henry James, any given event may seem to have already existed as fantasy, vision, or collage of related moments. Instead of offering a glimpse into his childhood experiences that shaped the writer, the book leaves us with uncertainties and mystery, encouraging us to remain curious and speculative about the workings of the boy's mind, and indeed of his own mind in its acts of recollection. In autobiography as defacement, that's a chapter from the book The Rhetoric of Romanticism, Paul de Man discusses the interconnections between fiction and autobiography, as well as the difficulties regarding the latter's status. He concluded that the dominant figure in autobiographical discourse is prosopopoeia, or the fiction of the voice from beyond the grave. One could argue that as a figure of an absent, deceased, or voiceless entity which posits the possibility of the entity's reply and confers upon it the power of speech, prosopopoeia is also a chief fictional device. However, the man also states that, in terms of style and narrative diction, prosopopoeia is the art of delicate transition. A feat easier to perform in autobiography than in epic narrative. Quoting Wordsworth, the Execution, de Man says that the gradual transformations occur in such a way that feelings that seem opposite to each other have another and finer connection than that of contrast. Let's examine this narrative diction diction in the same passage that Poirier employs in his fine commentary, a paragraph that intertwines and speculates about 3 moments of James's childhood that represent for him his positive initiation into history. So I must say, we don't have time to read it, so I'm sorry about that. So I'm just put it here. This is a part of the paragraph. You know, James's paragraphs are very long, so the other part is here. I go back and forth, so just to illustrate, to see if I'm saying what I'm saying is correct or not, but I'm sorry about that. We don't have time to read the whole paragraph. So skip that. Yes. James. It's fascinating to see how the various trusts of memory intertwine the Mexican-American War, which represents America's historic expansionism, with the 1848 revolution, which marked the beginning of the modern era. This combination tells volumes about what informs the young boy's imagination and shapes the trajectory of a future writer. However, I would like to slow down that most obvious inference and return to the idea of our stylistic analysis. I won't bore you with the details. The work is still in progress, so I'll give you some of the conclusions, okay? So, in general, we could say that James reinforces most of the traits related to his later prose in that passage, as studied by Ian Watt. These traits include long sentences with extensive subordination and frequent embedded relative clauses, participial phrases, and parenthetical structures. There's also a high proportion of function words, and there are more nouns than verbs, and the nouns tend to relate to abstractions and the historical sense that he's talking about here. So we could reiterate Watt's conclusion that the abstractions lead to a more expository rather than narrative prose. Through locating the text, this is what, in a mental rather than a physical continuum, the prose also gains a great freedom from the restrictions of particular time and place. In addition, we could relate to his finding that in James' text, what? Behind every petty individual circumstance, there ramifies an endless network of general moral, social, and historical relations, so that his style could be seen as a supremely civilized effort to relate every event and every moment of life to the full complexity of its circumambient conditions. More often than not, this passage seems to intensify all of that. We see even longer sentences, more subordinating constructions, and more abstractions. One difference between the first paragraph of the Ambassadors and our excerpts is, of course, the absence of irony. Unlike in the novel, we don't have exactly a narrator who translates what Strater sees into more general terms, which makes the narrative point of view intensely individual and ultimately social. To rephrase, we have an I narrator who describes what his I narrated saw. However, the terms are uncertain and, as Clark Mitchell might say, somewhat mystified. If the original vision comes from someone half asleep, his older self can't really assert whether his relative was coming from or going to the field of war. He's confounded when contrasting the cock-hatted and fettered image with the information that he himself had given that his uncle was a simple captain. The problem isn't that the child wouldn't know those things, of course. It's that his older self doesn't even try to look into them. What does matter here is a very personal effect, the historical thrill of the public order, prompted, in fact, by another event. So the time sequence here is complex, and it's easy to get lost if we don't pay close attention. Perhaps the sense of historical thrill arose earlier, when he was 5, with the announcement in New York by another set of uncles of the French Revolution of 1848 in the King's Flight. However, this news awakens or is awakened by another more ancient bipartite memory. At some point in his childhood, he tells his parents about the impression the Colonne and Place Vendôme made on him when he was 2 years old. Oh, no, sorry. I mixed up the order. So that's the Place Vendôme. It's a picture more or less from the same time that James was there when he was 2. Compared to the previous ambivalences, this primordial miraculous memory is definitive. Baby James, dressed in long clothes, wiggling his feet as he sees the tall column through the carriage window. It's a fleeting image, but it provides adequate context for his introduction to history. Neither the news nor the recollection of the column functions alone. Nothing explains his preliminary aesthetic appreciation of the square except that, to him, it was the center of the universe, his own geopolitical omphalos or umbilicus mundi. In her analysis of the American scene in the Pós da Queda, my colleague here, dear colleague Luiza Larangeira, quotes Maurice Blanchot's assessment of James' art, in which he says, each instant to produce the entire work present, and even behind the constructed and limited work that he shapes, to make all the forms felt, the infinite and light space of the narrative as it could have been, as it is before any beginning. The same idea could be applied to his autobiography, but now in this narrative of his beginnings with an even more dramatic emphasis. Elsewhere, that's in the space of fiction, of literature, Blanchot states that every man is called upon to take again the mission of Noah, meaning that we impregnate the provisional and perishable earth so profoundly in our mind that its essence can be reborn in us invisible. Approaching Rilke's idea that the interior space of the poem translates things, Blanchot goes a step further. He calls the poet the essential translator, and the poem's space the space of the mightiest circulation and ceaseless metamorphosis, where things cease to be visible and begin to dwell in invisible intimacy, where our outward worldly realities lose their value and falsified nature. In other words, they lose their narrow boundaries in order to penetrate their true profundity. Through Rilke's interiorization transmutation, all the configurations of the here and now are to be used not in a time-bound way, as the poet states in a letter. It is an inner space of consciousness in which we are introduced to the given conditions of earthly existence independent of time and space. Blanchot and Rilke sees this incessant movement of conversion as related to our end, this fruition of the visible into the invisible, for which we are responsible, is the very task of dying. So here impulse toward the autobiographical memorialization stems not only from William's death, but also from the sight of his sister and parents' graves in the Cambridge cemetery. So that's the, I mixed up the order. An image bristling with merciless memory. This is James talking. It seemed as if James had returned to America for precisely this vision and moment. The novelist called it the cold Medusa face of life. It's a simple image. Life is treacherous, but also Medusa, as the stone converter monster, was the very personification of death for the ancient Greeks, because stone was the perfect representation for them of a body no longer filled with life-giving fluid, but dried and dead. If gazing upon Medusa means dying and becoming the epitome of death, the bard Orpheus stands as the solitary figure with the audacity to traverse the space, not as one who has vanquished death, but as Blanchot asserts, as one who perpetually perishes. He is the emblem of the poetic plenitude, the origin of song and the song as origin, and the sacrificial point which is no longer the reconciliation of two domains, but the abyss of the lost God, the infinite trace of absence. He, Orpheus, was dismembered to make us hearers and a mouth of nature. He's citing Rilke here, Sonnets to Orpheus, and the original is Sind wir der Horrenden jetzt und ein Mund der Natur. It's no wonder then that James' story of the origins is also the sacrificial reiteration of death, with almost all the living people of his narrative already dead, but perhaps not gone. In particular, his straight dive into the past and his sounding out of the periods in tones of resonant assurance, as described by Theodora Bosanquet, bear a striking resemblance to the Rilkean image of the Mund der Natur. Going back to our paragraph, you tell me, Natasha, if I'm going too long. I can stop any time, and if you are bored as well, please just tell me. Going back to our paragraph, we see how it works. Apart from that eerily precocious impressions that baffles James' parents, nothing is very certain. Everything seems to be in a state of flux, of constant correction, adjustment, revision. The parenthetical sentences and the subordination help to build up this state of pervasiveness. Speaking further on the Noah condition of the human consciousness, Blanchot explains, yes, every man is Noah, but on closer inspections he is Noah in a strange way, and his mission consists less in saving everything from the flood than on the contrary, in plunging all things into a deeper flood where they disappear prematurely and radically. That in fact is what the human vocation amounts to. What we have in James's passage then is not only a representation of the remembering being, but also the very being itself, precarious and doubtful, which takes every little remnant of reality into its inner flooding arc. And maybe it's more than that, because these things don't really exist anymore as a present corporeality. Extinct matter, they are taken out of the flow as they seem to be remembered, only to plunge back into it again, retranslated and metamorphosed. The sequences of sentences also reinforce the same movement, tending to undermine or complicate what has gone before. It does not always seem to go forwards, but also backwards, crisscrossing, leading us into a constant circular movement. I'm going to skip a little bit here. James appears to be concocting the very dramatization of memory as it unfolds in the present of recollection. So, as Peter Brooks shows, James abhorred what he called the American money-grabbing democracy, without old familiarities and heredities. A democracy then without past, only the bloated present and future. And without the past, there would be no forms and no manners, or manners as form, and in an interesting term, without the economic advantages that such more traditional arrangement would entail. American iconoclasm also represents a sort of accumulation that starts with accumulation, nearly the end here, with the accumulation of dollars and ends up informing its cultural novelties, such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which speaks of acquisition if need be, on the highest terms. That's James. Or, as Brooks describes, the Metropolitan is not a place of creation, but rather a place of accumulation of treasures created in other places and ages. But how can we take his autobiography, which seems to speak of an incredible accumulation? Is it perhaps not an accumulation when brought about by experience, by a past conjured with all the failings of memory, with all the artificiality of fiction. That's a question, of course. Let's return to the juxtaposition or fusion of those two apparently different events of the public order. They are linked by the image of a window, the vision of his uncle seen against the light of the window, and the spectacle of the Vendôme column framed by the window of the passing car. Though they are far apart on different continents and different times, they are united by the uncertain voyeuristic spectator and the even more uncertain memorialist. They are both, here I think, no, yeah, they're both symbols of imperial power, though James would only fully understand the domestic one when he returned to America in 1904 and 5. Perhaps only the phallic splendor of the Parisian icon here would have appealed to the young James, but his older self would have been familiar with the various versions of the Napoleon statue that crowned it, from the first statue in Roman dress to the one that shattered when the communards brought it down in 1871. Power is impermanent and fleeting. The one James saw in his childhood is this. Was in full gala attire, wearing though the mere petit caporal uniform with a bicorn hat and boots. And here I'm quoting from this pamphlet. The real dress of a hero, the man who made France the most powerful nation of modern times and ignited revolutions in both words, according to this contemporary pamphlet from its inauguration by Louis Philippe, the same king who would later run away. We should take note of this. The past, history, precarious, equivocal, fragmentary, ghostly, contradictory is all we have at the end of the day to face the barbarians of that, here is James, of that perpetual, passionate, pecuniary purpose which plays with all forms, which derides and devours them. Thank you. So you see, there's no ending. What I'm trying to go to is to think about this criticism of James, of the formlessness of this American capitalist democracy, and the fact that many readers see his autobiography formless as well. So thinking about two kinds of formlessness and thinking of the difference they have. So I think they're, of course, not the same, but it's interesting to see they are, well, related somehow, or at least I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcelo, for this very engaging talk. I have at least 3 questions for you later. Yes, to break the ice. Now we will move on to Luiza's presentation entitled Beyond Truth and Lie, Jamesian Realism and the Status of Fiction. Thank you, Luiza, for preparing this presentation.
Thank you, Natasha. It's a pleasure to share this panel with Marcelo and to have you as a mediator. So I think I need to exchange the PowerPoint. I will read, of course, because I could speak impromptu in English, and I need to keep in my time, into the limits of my time. Okay, so it's working. Okay, let's go. I put on my glasses. Okay. Henry James was not only an exceptionally gifted fiction writer, but also an insightful and keen theorist of fiction. In my talk today, I intend to address James' ideas on the status of fiction in its relation to history and reality on the one hand, and to truth and line on the other. To that end, I will divide my presentation into two parts. In the first part, I will draw on some literary theorists who, over the past 50 years, have been discussing the concept of fiction from the perspective of its historicity. In the second part, I will examine how James addresses the questions of the status of fiction in texts such as The Art of Fiction, first published in 1884, and the famous preface to the New York edition of The Portrait of a Lady, published in 1908. So, let's go to part one. Okay. Are fiction writers liars? As João Duarte already explained on this conference first day, the German philosopher Hans Blumenberg notes in a 1964 article that, I quote, "The history of Western literary theory can be summed up as a continuous debate on the classical dictum that poets are liars." He argues that either the classical dictum or its antithesis, that poets tell the truth, have become topoi in the history of Western static theory. According to Blumenberg, the classical dictum has its origin in the Platonic distrust of mimesis and in the idea developed in the Book 10th of the Republic that since the sensible world is merely a copy of the world of ideas, poetry, in imitating it, is nothing more than a copy of a copy. On the other hand, its antithesis, that is, the idea that poets tell the truth, implies either that literature refers to a given outside reality, whatever that reality may be, or that literature creates a reality of its own. Either way, the connection between literature and truth implies the connection between literature and reality. Nonetheless, it's not uncommon for literary theorists engaged in addressing the question of fiction and its historical definitions to argue that in moments when fiction acquires a conceptual contours, its meaning stands to distinguish it from both truth and falsehood. Catherine Gallagher, in her well-known article entitled The Rise of Fictionality, argues that one of such moments is the emergence of the novel as a new literary genre in the 18th century. I quote, "The historical connection between the terms novel and fiction is intimate. They were mutually constitutive. If a genre can be thought of as having an attitude, the novel has seemed ambivalent toward its fictionality, at once inventing it as an ontological ground and placing severe constraints upon it. Candidly and explicitly differentiating their works from the kinds of referentiality preferred by neighboring genres, these writers coaxed their readers to accept the imaginative status of their characters. And yet, the same 18th century novelists also seem to have imprisoned and concealed the fictionality by locking it inside the confines of the credible. The novel, in short, is said both to have discovered and to have obscured fiction." Although Gallagher's argument summarized in this passage is well known, I believe it's worth presenting it with some care. She argues that as realist novel takes shape in the 18th century, becoming linked to everyday historical and social experience, it becomes necessary to redefine the status of fiction in order to distinguish it from pure fantasy, deceit, and falsehood. At the same time, it was also necessary to distinguish the novel from narrative prose genres which deal with referential truth, such as history, biography, autobiography, and French and English romances, which exalted particular courtly lords and ladies, turning them into exemplars of virtues, or the chroniques scandaleuses and libello satires, which mocked the romance conventions and reversed their judgment. The novels of Daniel Defoe, Henry Fielding, and Samuel Richardson are far removed from the tales of marvels, demons, and hauntings that characterized the Greek and Latin, chivalric, picaresque, and Baroque romances. But they are also very distant from the chroniques scandaleuses and satires, which referred to the wicked aristocrats while disguising their identities by making up allegorical names for them. The fantastical nature of the characters and events narrated in ancient, medieval, and early modern prose narratives, by their very unrealistic nature, prevented them from being mistaken for real people and situations. If they could not be confused with truthful discourse, they also could not be accused of lying, deceit, or falsehood. The realistic novel that begins to develop in the 18th century, however, recounts events and presents characters that closely resemble those we encounter in historical and social reality. If these events did not actually occur, and these characters are not based on real people, how can we avoid accusing such narratives of being nothing more than a collection of lies? With the rise of the modern novel, fiction must find its own space, one that is distinct both from lies and referential truth, but that nonetheless does not imply the absolute freedom that the ancient satirist Lucian of Samosata attributes to poets, dreams, and paintings. According to Gallagher, the modern novel presents the reader with a paradox. It simultaneously reveals and conceals its fictionality. It does so by developing techniques of non-referentiality that allow it to narrate people and events that are both fictional and believable, telling fictional situations that could plausibly occur in the real social world, and fictional characters who could plausibly be real people. In this way, the novel promotes a new articulation between fiction and a new kind of verisimilitude, realist verisimilitude. As Roland Barthes puts it, with the modern novel, I quote, "A new verisimilitude is born, which is precisely realism, understood as any discourse that accepts only enunciations credited by the referent. The establishment of a distinct status for fiction between the 18th and the 19th centuries also depended on the separation of two genres of discourse, literature and history, which had previously been united within the unique, though heterogeneous space of belles-lettres. In antiquity and early modern period, both history and poetry were genres within the poetical rhetorical framework of the Western tradition, fulfilling simultaneously ethical, static, and epistemological functions. History, as a rhetorical genre, presented itself as magistra vitae, teacher of life, and poetry followed Horatian precepts of delighting and instructing. The 18th and 19th centuries witnessed the separation between the two. History was converted into science, while poetry became fictional literature, increasingly confined to the realm of the statistics. These transformations, however, constituted a relatively slow process that lasted approximately 100 years, beginning in the mid-18th century and reaching completion by the time Henry James began publishing his novels, short stories, and literary criticism. Part 2. Henry James and the Art of Fiction. The question of the status of fiction and its relationship to the novel was addressed by James in a more systematic way in his famous 1884 essay, The Art of Fiction. The essay is presented as a commentary on Walter Besant's text of the same name, derived from a lecture delivered at the Royal Institution, in which the English novelist seeks to define and regulate the art of fiction. On his own text, James discusses the specificity and the epistemological, ethical, and aesthetic value of the fictional discourse. I quote, "The novel," says James, "must take itself seriously for the public to take it so. The old superstition about fiction being wicked has doubtless died out in English, but the spirit of it lingers in a certain oblique regard directed toward any story which does not more or less admit that it's only a joke. Even the most jocular novel feels in some degree the weight of the proscription that was formerly directed against literary levity. The jocularity does not always succeed in passing for gravity. It is still expected, though perhaps people are ashamed to say it, that a production, which is after all only make-believe, for what else is a story, shall be in some degree apologetic, shall renounce the pretension of attempting really to compete with life. First, it's worth noting that in the passage the passage begins with the tacit association, at times even a synonym, between fiction and the novel that Gallagher points out. Second, James refers to a historical mistrust of fiction tied to the superstition that the novel is wicked, mere make-believe, and therefore should make it clear that it does not aspire to truth, that it's a mere fiction and should renounce the pretension of representing life. Later in the text, James argues that the Horatian precept that poetry should be instructive and delightful is transformed into a Protestant prohibition against, I quote, artistic preoccupations such as the quest of form, which are seen not only as superfluous but also as dangerous. James, by contrast, defends the idea that, I quote, the only reason for the existence of a novel is that it does attempt to represent life. This claim is supported by two comparisons. The first is the comparison between the novelist and the painter, which unfolds into an analogy between the novel and painting. Okay, I quote. The analogy between the art of the painter and the art of the novelist is, so far as I am able to see, complete. Their inspiration is the same. Their process, allowing for the different quality of the vehicle, is the same. Their success is the same. As the picture is reality, so the novel is history. That is the only general description which does it justice that we may give the novel. But history also is allowed to compete with life, as I say. It's not, any more than painting, expected to apologize. The subject matter of fiction is stored up likewise in documents and records, and if it will not give itself away, as they say in California, it must speak with assurance, with the tone of the historian. The analogy between the novel and painting thus unfolds into an analogy between the novel and history, between the novelist and the historian. Rather than presenting itself as a mere storyteller engaging in make-believe, the fiction writer must become aware that the novel is history, in the sense of historiography. History, too, is expected to represent life. The comparison between fiction and history is a classical topos, recurring in Western literary debate since at least Aristotle's theory of mimesis. The starting point of this tradition is the famous passage from the Poetics in which the Stagirite compares poetry and history. For Aristotle, history and poetry are distinguished by the fact that the former deals with what actually happened, while the latter concerns what could happen. For this reason, poetry is more philosophical, more truthful than history, since it brings about the transition from the particular to the universal. The truth of history is the truth of facts, a second-order truth, as it is entirely particular and contingent. Poetic truth, on the other hand, though it does not reach the absolute status of the truth sought by philosophy, it's nonetheless superior to that of history, as it is capable of transitioning to the universal. The Aristotelian topos of the superiority of poetry over history is revived in the early 18th century in the context of the dispute between the novel and historiography over which genre is better suited to truthfully represent reality. Henry Fielding, for example, in the preface to Joseph Andrews, presents his book not as a novel, but as true history, drawing on the idea that fiction is more truthful than historiography, since the latter recounts the actions of particular individuals, while the former refers to types rather than individuals, thus being closer to the universal. However, when James revisits the comparison between fiction and history in the second half of the 19th century, it's not so much to insist on the superiority of fiction over history as to place them on equal footing. For James, the work of the novelist, no less than that of the historian, is, I quote, to represent the past, to represent and illustrate the past, the actions of men. And the only difference that I can see is in proportion as he succeeds to the honor of the novelist, consisting as it does in its having more difficulty in collecting his evidence, which is so far from being purely literary. This equivalence between the work of the historian and that of the novelist aims to support the argument that fiction draws its material from historical and social reality, insofar it refers to reality, is not mere make-believe, but rather a truthful discourse. However, it is important to keep in mind that the parallel between the novelist and the historian in James' essay is primarily analogical, just like the comparison between the novelist and the painter. This analogy should not obscure what, for James, constitutes the specificity of fiction. The evidence the novelist collects is mediated by their experience of reality. I believe that it's That's why James argues that it's more difficult for the novelist than for the historian to gather evidence. While the historian, or at least the 19th century historian James had in mind, draws on official sources, the novelist's evidence is mediated by his own experience. This is also why James contends that the novel should always represent life. He says life instead of reality, because the reality available to the fiction writer is shaped by their own lived experience. Hans Blumenberg, in the article mentioned earlier, argues that the relation of fiction to truth is based on the relation of fiction to reality, and more precisely, to a specific concept of reality, he says, may be defined as actualization of actualization of a context in itself. The third type of reality João was explaining 2 days ago. I quote, "This concept takes reality as the result of an actualization, a progressive certainty which can never reach a total or final consistence, as it always looks forward to a future that might contain elements which could shatter previous consistence and so render previous realities unreal. Even when a person's life space is complete, we can only say that his reality has been continuous, that such and such constituted his illusions, delusions, and imaginings, in other words, his reality. It's typical of this particular concept that the possessive adjective is linked with the word reality. My hypothesis is that in the art of fiction, James theorizes a similar concept of reality, arguing that in order to represent life, the novel must draw on the novelist's experience, and that this experience constitutes his reality. The importance of the notions of experience, consciousness, and impression for the philosophy and art of the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, from Henry Bergson to the American pragmatists, including the Impressionist painters, is also evident in the way Henry James conceives of the literary representation of reality. In The Art of Fiction, he states that, I quote, experience consists of impressions. One may say simply that impressions are experience, since they are the very air we breathe. End of quotation. As for the content of experience, if it's not infinite, it is at least enormously varied and completely indeterminate. For James' experience, although it establishes a connection between the subject and something external to them, is also an integral part of subjectivity, part of each individual's consciousness. From this dual nature of experience, both external and internal, arises the argument that both the unconscious human process of forming knowledge about reality and the conscious process of representing it in literature are simultaneously empirical and subjective. Empirical in the sense that they are nourished by lived experience, subjected in that, as part of consciousness itself, they are ultimately singular and individual. This eminently subjective and individual aspect of both cognitive and representational process is described by James in the famous preface to the New York edition of The Portrait of a Lady. Through a metaphor in which fictional narrative is compared to a great house with an indeterminate number of windows, through which different authors look out at life and form different impressions and representations of the same reality. I will quote. The house of fiction has, in short, not one, but a million, a number of possible windows not to be reckoned rather, every one of which has been pierced or is still pierceable in its vast front by the need of the individual vision and by the pressure of the individual will. These apertures of dissimilar shape and size hang so altogether over the human scene that we might have expected of them a great sameness of report than we find. They are but windows at the best, mere holes in a dead wall, disconnected, perched aloft. They are not hinged doors opening straight upon life, but they have this mark of their own, that each of them stands a figure at each of them stands a figure with a pair of eyes, or at least with field glass, which forms again and again for observation a unique instrument, ensuring to the person making use of it an impression distinct from every other. To conclude my talk, I would like to draw attention to an important consequence of the concept of reality that James is working with, and its relationship to the idea of experience. As we have seen through Blumenberg's definition, this is a contextual, perspectival reality, one that is preceded by the possessive pronoun. It is the reality of each novelist, unique, singular, and distinct from the reality of any other novelist. And yet, and this is equally important, every fictional reality is composed of the same material, the same human scene, the same life. All the windows of the house of fiction look out from different perspectives onto life. This suggests that, though this metaphor of the house of fiction, through this metaphor of the house of fiction, James is addressing the truth of fiction, a mode of discourse distinct from historiography truth, yet equally distinct from falsehood or deception. That is, thank you.
Thank you, Luiza, for this engaging talk. So to continue Luiza's tradition initiated in this conference, I will start by making brief questions to each speaker to break the ice, right? So, Marcelo, in your talk, you analyze how James's A Small Boy and Others departs from a certain genre, how it's quite different from expectations, from a certain format, from a specific genre. So could you talk more about that? Like, do you think that this is related to a different conception of Bildungsroman, although it's not a fictional in its strict sense? But it's open to debate, of course. But is this related to, as an alternative, a different view on the autobiography itself? Or is this related to his later style, or a mix of everything? Like, that's it. And then for Luiza. Luiza, in your studies concerning history and fiction, history and literature, it comes to my mind the linguistic turn in history. And then I think of Roland Barthes, as you have already mentioned him, and also of Hayden White. And do you think that the linguistic turn in history somehow relates to those debates in the century before, in the 19th century? You know, that those debates, they have roots in this discussion, and then James is a part of it. Like, okay.
Thank you for the question. It's a very good question, but I don't know if I can answer it. Of course, I think I would go more with Poirier, who thinks it tends towards a fictionality or fiction in a way that James sometimes he gives us his version of the facts, and even like in the second volume, changing what his father wrote and changing things, which is very interesting. Of course, it's related to his later style, as you said. There's a bit of a Bildungsroman, perhaps, but not in the sense we are used to, and this formative. Yes, it doesn't go like that. It's not. It's very further from this classical Bildungsroman, but it's not only fiction. It is in between, I think, this genre. And what I was thinking about, but I couldn't develop any further, is that it relates to a very modernist prose and modernist novels and stories in the way that it goes in this very kind of paradoxical presentation of life. But if you look at it closely, I think I could relate to Poe's presentation, because at first it seems complicated, but then if you look at it closely, you can find new patterns, like you can find it underneath or together with this very complicated prose of his. So I think that's very modernist. If you have to take into consideration the style, and so you are looking at both things at the same time, and you gain by looking at both things. You gain more insights, and So, and for me, as I was saying, this formlessness, it's not really a formlessness. That seems like that, but of course, I'm trying to see what kind of form it has. But of course, it's not like the critic, I forgot his name now, said. It's not like a traditional autobiography. You can't look at it in this way. I don't know if I answer it, but thank you.
Thank you. Great answer, Marcelo.
Thank you, Natasha, for your excellent question. You are absolutely right. I am a professor of theory of history, so my theoretical framework is the linguistic turn. And Hayden White is one of my favorite authors. And yes, White says, for example, that the modernist writers have discovered that the represented reality is a linguistic one, and they should set a model from for the historians. So White is interested on the fictional, the literary, first of all, but also the fictional dimension of historiography. He says that every historian, every 19th century historian, follow a pattern of plot. I don't know, a tragic plot or a romantic plot or a comic plot. So he is interested on the fictional and literary and rhetorical dimension of historiography. What interests me on James is the other way around, is the historical dimension of fiction and how he borrows some of the the process of historiography, or he thinks he borrows, thinks the fiction writer borrows some of the process of the historian to represent reality. So I think they are connected. Yeah.
Thank you, Luiza. So now we will open for discussions.
Thank you both for two very complicated and very fascinating presentations about very interesting texts from very different parts of James's career. You know, I'm struck, Marcelo, you're thinking about Small Boy and others at the very end of James's life. And Luiza, The Art of Fiction, in the 1880s, from his realist period, just after he wrote Portrait of a Lady, you know, Small Boy and others, not only after the major phase, but after rethinking all of his works, revising the New York edition, at the very end of his life, very complicated sentences. I'd like to ask a question that would bring both of the papers in relation to each other, and I'm going to try, and I apologize if it's too much of a stretch. But the thing that I was thinking about in both papers is the relationship between language and imagination. And in Marcel, I love the way in which you started by thinking about Small Boys and Boy and others through the question of the Jamesian sentence in The Ambassadors and Ian Watt's classic explication of the first paragraph. And I'd like to hear more, as someone who's, you've translated James's, I've worked on James's prefaces and his theory of fiction. My recollection of the Small Boy and Others, which I need to go back and read now, is that one of the really wonderful, charming things about it is James's creation of a character, the small boy, who walks around wondering and gaping, and I can't remember the exact phrase, but the creation of this persona of the small boy is a linguistic creation of persona using language that leaves me with a sense of James as describing the birth of the artist through the emergence of the capacity for wonder, the capacity for imagination, the capacity to observe, the birth of his consciousness through the creation of language. This reminded me, in some sense, of what you were talking about, Luiza, in talking about how James is saying that the writer's responsibility, a novelist's responsibility, is to be an historian, which would seem to me that what James is talking about is the importance of modes of writing. And actually, the title of your talk, Truth and Lie, I thought you were going to talk about Nietzsche's, Truth and Lie, Wahrheit und Lüge im außermoralischen Sinne, Truth and Lie in extramoral sense, talk about writing. And interestingly, The Art of Fiction, as you know, you mentioned, was a response to Walter Besant's idea that you could write a novel by having particular rules for writing, which James said were too limited. He said The Art of Fiction, as he wrote it, was a plea for the writer's freedom, the freedom of imagination. And interestingly, you connect it to this image of consciousness, and there are artists' imagination at different windows in the Portrait of a Lady preface, and how for James, the novelist and the historian are both drawing on experience, the category of experience. So experience and freedom. I'm wondering, where, in your sense of this, in art fiction, does James see language? And what is the relationship of language to the arguments that he's making about freedom and experience and representation in the art of fiction? Its absence actually calls out for reflection about its implicit presence. So if that's a question that would bring both talks into relationship to each other, I'd be really interested to hear your dialogue. So thank you both.
So thank you, Paul. And thank you for the wonderful question and also for the way you've been engaging with all the panels and the talks and in a very generous ways. And for me, I think, I don't have an answer to that, I think, because it's just, I think it opened a very obvious, but I wasn't looking at that way, this construction of this character, this it's flickering image that comes and goes, and it's very interesting through language, and that's perhaps that's here the answer that I'm looking for. And of course, you said the birth of consciousness and historical consciousness. A 2-year-old child, how can he? Yeah, or anybody. So it's very, very strange and very interesting. And I agree, absolutely agree. I don't have an answer, but if I could engage Luiza as well, perhaps going to the portrait of a lady, the preface, because there, as I remember, Luiza, maybe I'm not right, in that passage, before, yes, he said life. Yeah, as Virginia Woolf would say, life many times, not reality. But here he has human scene. Mm-hmm. Human scene is another thing. It has this kind of theatricality. Yes, thank you. And also the field glass that really complicates the thing about going see the scene. It's complicated when you have an instrument like that. So, as I was saying, this, of course, is the answer, because we are going into this modernist mode where the language and the linguistics are very important, and we have to take that into consideration to give the right answers. So it's the scene, not life. It's a different thing. And so how can we relate to that? So. Yeah, thank you so much. I don't have an answer, but just a note of thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paul. I think it's a good way to provoke me, because I was answering Natasha about the relationship between the linguistic turn and the way I see James' work. And the linguistic turn is mainly concerned with language, the ways language form reality, the ways language represent reality. And James does not talk about language. He talks about experience, he talks about consciousness, he talks about imagination, and on the other side, he talks about life, he talks about reality. Reality has a myriad of forms, and he talks about human scene. In the preface of the American scene, he talks about human scene as well. But he not talks directly about language. So I don't know if I am also stretching James too much, but I would say that, I don't know, it's hypothetical. I'm not sure about that. But if I think about a novel as What Mesa Knew, there I think he is consciously concerned about language. The childish language, the language of the young girl, how she can express linguistically her thoughts, what she knows, and also her imagination. So it makes me think that probably here, in the art of fiction and in the major phase, James is also concerned with language, even if he doesn't talk about it. These apertures in the house of fiction, the shape of the apertures only can be expressed by language, through language. It's the way the writer perceives the the reality or life or the human scene, but also is the shape, is the form he expresses it. But it's interesting, he doesn't develop a theory of language in this sense. It's, I don't know, I have the impression that James is more concerned to the way the writer receives reality or receives life or perceives reality and life, and not the way he expresses it. But on the other hand, he's a writer concerned with language in a way. His metaphors are very, I don't know, elaborated. So I think it's the way the writer perceives, but also the way he expresses.
Can I add something? Because Luiza's mention of what Mesa knew reminds me of the preface to The Golden Bowl. And in the preface, James says that the novel shows the labyrinth of the consciousness of the poet. So it's uncommon. It's a very uncommon way. It's very Jamesian to say that it's a poet and not a novelist. So he calls the author, he calls himself the poet, and I think that it's about language. So the language is related to poetry, the labyrinth, that it's something intricate, and to the consciousness, that it's what you said, like how he receives reality or life. So that's just a link, like the labyrinth of the consciousness of the poet, because his language is like a labyrinth. It's like a maze labyrinth.
And also the revisions of his texts. He talks in that preface about the work of the revision, doesn't he? The preface, yes. So it's related to the question. Yes.
Actually, it's a provocation, not a question. I just would like to hear people comment on one of my favorite passages in the art of fiction. Henry James is quoting somebody who says, "Oh, the writer has to write about what he knows," and then he says, "Well, there's a lady novelist I know that she wrote a very good novel about the French Huguenots." Huguenots? And I love that. And says, "What do you know about the Huguenots?" I said, "Well, once I was in a hotel somewhere, and I was going up the stairs with somebody says, and they pointed to a family sitting around the table and said, 'Oh, those are French Huguenots.' Oh, and that's it. And on the basis of that, she wrote a whole novel. So how does that fit in with your discussion of historicity versus fictionality?
Okay. No, it's a wonderful passage. Paul was mentioned it on the first day. So I think that in this moment, James is arguing in favor of the free, the autonomy of art. Because Walter Besant is putting rules to the fiction. And he's saying, no, there is no rules. The only rule is that a novel has to be interesting. So it's a vague rule. But, and he says, reality has a myriad of forms, and it has a myriad of forms because experience is subjective, is objective and subjective, not completely subjective, but also objective. So you don't have to be a Protestant or a Huguenot to write a novel about that. You just have to have some experience of it. It's like, and the writer, she's climbing stairs, if I remember, and she sits inside a house. That's it. They are having dinner, and it's an aperture, like a window, like a window in the house of fiction. So it's just a glimpse but it becomes experience, the experience of the writer. So it's the human scene. It's probably the same objective reality of the historian, but it's the difference between for James, I think, because I think James has in mind the 19th century historian, the Hunken historian who is tied, who is linked to that actually happened. And the fictionist, he has more liberty because he's not tied to reality, to what actually happened. He's tied to his experience of what actually happened. So I think for James, that's the difference. It's the same reality, it's the same human scene, it's a sociological and historical human scene, but he has the glasses of his own experience between himself and reality. Don't know if I answered you.
Yeah, so that question is not just for me. I think I'm not the expert, but it's a very good question, and I think relating to what Luiza said, the experience, this example that he gave, that writer didn't have, in principle at least, much experience about the French Huguenots and so forth. But in A Small Boy and Others, of course, he had lots of experiences. He's seen it all, but he's still, not all the time, but there's this thing about the glimpses. So in the passage that I didn't read, but what I was trying to analyze, there are the windows again, or the presence of the windows. So the windows, when he saw his uncle, he was sort of obscureceu, how do we say that? Obscured the image of his uncle because he was contra luz, against the light, I don't know, yeah? And when he saw the Vendôme column, that was passing through as well, through the window of the carriage. And I'm remembering as well in the American scene, when he saw the reality of the America, the very poor people, not all the time, but through the window of the Pullman train. So there's this voyeuristic characteristic of James seen in a place of, in a certain place, I don't know exactly where, and yes, so I had a question to Luiza, but now I forgot. But I think this thing about seeing glimpses of reality, and then he can elaborate and create, as you said, sociological portraits and anthropological portraits and things like that. But knowing all, or doesn't, even when he does know a lot, he still goes back to this kind of way that he prefers. I don't know.
And can I say just something? I think it's very important, this window metaphor and this idea of aperture. Paul and I went on Tuesday to an exposition at EMS of a photographer called Luis Braga. And he was also obsessed about windows and apertures and mirrors. And we were saying that he is very Jamesian because James was, I think he was very concerned about the way we receive or perceive reality. And it's always through some form, some shape. Maybe it's the connection with language, because language is form, is a kind of reality constructed by a specific form. So we receive and perceive reality in a specific form, and we express reality also in a specific form.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You have the frame. So that's form. Yes. Yeah, it's not the whole reality, but this is...
Wonderful discussion, and I just would add a couple more things, sort of impulses to the discussion. You may remember that after James published The Art of Fiction, Robert Louis Stevenson wrote back to him in an essay called A Humble Remonstrance, reminding James that form matters. And Stevenson, the Treasure Island, the storyteller. So and James wrote back and said, "Oh yes, of course you're right." But this emphasis on apertures and perspectives and glimpses. I mean, he talks the example you talked about, French Protestant youth and Anne Thackeray Ritchie seeing a glimpse. James says she had her impression. It was personal and it was direct. Well, if it's personal, it's not direct. If it's direct, it's not personal. There's that contradiction. But it has to do with the aperture, with the frame, with the glimpse. And that reminds me, Marcelo, of Small Boy and Others, where James, and I think I think of the Small Boy and Others of the character he makes there as, who's transforming what Maisie knew into himself, the transformative power of the imagination, which in his autobiography, he also connects. You use the term theatricality, which I think is wonderful. Growing up in New York and Washington Square, he has a sense of the theater, and the aperture of the theater stage, and what's beyond the passage in Art of Fiction we're talking about. He credits Anne Thackeray Ritchie with the power to guess the unseen from the seen. What's beyond the frame? You see what's framed, and then you imagine beyond it. That transcendence, that power of the beyond. So I do think there are all sorts of interesting connections between these two texts that seem so dissimilar. So thank you.
Thank you.
Posso fazer? Thank you, Marcelo and Luiza, for your interesting presentations. I actually see a connection between the two. I think you're both talking about the relation between fiction and historical genres. Autobiography and biography are also historical genres. I have a question for each of you. I'll start with Luiza. Luiza, you mentioned Henry Fielding in your talk, and his claim that the novel has some claim to historical truth, although perhaps in a very different sense from James. But it's interesting that James, if I remember correctly, what he prescribes for the narrator in fiction, in a novel, is some kind of an ethic of non-interference in the story, and which goes very much against Henry Fielding's practice of a chatty narrator. How do you see this difference, and does Henry Fielding? Do you think James does what he preaches in terms of the narrator? And Marcelo, you in your response to Natasha's question, you were saying that behind the convoluted sentences and style of Henry James, you could perceive some patterns, right? And could you elaborate a little more on this? What these patterns would be, and if you've also seen the formlessness of American capitalist culture, some kind of patterns.
I'm not sure if James prescribing this kind of rule of no interference. I think he criticized Trollope, for example, Trollope's chatty narrator, but because Trollope chat's narrator is apologizing for the fictionality of his fiction, what we were talking to Tiago 2 days ago. Because Trollope says, "Oh, I'm sorry, this is mere fiction, this is mere make-believe," and this for James is a really problematic. Of course, I think in his fiction, in James' fiction, we don't find many chatty narrators. We don't find a narrator who is assessing or judging the action very much. Sometimes I think There are some moments, but it's not like Fielding. It's not a pattern. But I think he's in the art of fiction. He's saying in a way that not only the narrator but the writer or the implied author interferes in the scene he is narrating. He interferes precisely because he has his own perspective. His own perspective interferes. He's not interferes with judgment, but his perspective interferes the shape of the frame and the frame of the aperture through which he's looking into reality or life or human scene. I think it's literary form, this aperture. And I remember James Wood's analysis of the famous James Wood analysis of what Mesa knew. I think you know that. And he says, for example, that the language, sometimes the language of the girl is, sometimes the author expresses himself with the language of the girl, sometimes with the language of his own, James' language. So in this way, I think he interferes, and he is conscious that it's not possible not to interfere. But I think not through the chatting narrator as in Fielding.
Thank you, João. That's a very good question as well. I don't think it's formlessness. There are forms. I don't know exactly which they are exactly, but I think it's curious. But that his criticism of the money-grubbing democracy is the fact that it has no forms because it doesn't go into the past, and so that's a very interesting and very way to think about that society. And Peter Brooks also says, relating to this, in this latest book, Henry James Comes Home, he makes an analysis that the form for James is this frame, the fact that they're frames. And so I think there's a building or somewhere in Cambridge, I forgot which, there was a frame around it, and he complimented it for having this fence, a fence around one of the buildings there, because it contains something. So for James, it's very interesting. He wants to contain. But you were asking about the patterns. That's very difficult. But I could give you an example. The fact that we are dealing with paradoxes and aporias. How do you say that? Apori? Yeah. Yeah. Aporias, yes, aporias. And so, for instance, this he saw his uncle. He's telling about. That's an autobiography. So he says he doesn't know if his uncle, who was a captain, was coming from or going to the war, and that's okay, no big deal. And he was seeing him as someone half asleep, and against the window light. Okay. And then he describes the way he saw his uncle in the panoply of war and dressed with a hat and everything. But he says, but that doesn't make sense because I just said he was a simple captain. So you think, like the older James would say, well, I may say now that he wasn't a simple captain, or I don't know, he would look into it. But for him, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. And he lives it like at that. And so we don't know. We have to, well, that's a part of the pattern or he's trying to construct. And he's not going to give us answers.
And in that passage, the only very concrete thing is the tall column and the description he makes. He's not sitting, he's sitting in front of his parents, he's dressed in long clothes, he's wiggling his feet. So it's very interesting to think of James as a 2-year-old. That's very intimate. That's very intimate, this picture, and that's very concrete. But the other around this, they are not. And so that was saying, but I don't have an answer. I'm still looking into those very complicated patterns. But I was, in a simple way, I would say paradoxes or aporias or contradictions. But they're not really contradictions because, no, it's just two ways, ambivalences, perhaps. I don't know. Thank you.
Yes, sure.
There's the coffee break.
No, I'm joking. Wow, thank you guys for those excellent talks. It was great to hear you. I'll be quick, I promise. I have a question for both of you. So for Marcelo, well, I have to apologize for my obsession with visual art because my question is going to be about that again, the last time, I promise. So Marcelo, you were saying that A Small Boy and Others is a book about impressions, right? Uncertainty. Not about, but, you know. Yes. And you even mentioned a scene about Place Condom, and you said it was a fleeting image. So did you notice any visual effects or nuances that were converted into textual devices that helped to create those impressions, you know, this fleeting imagery or this blend of memory and history, this uncertainty, as you said? So that's my question to you. And for Luiza, I'm just curious if you plan to include Clara Reeves' work in your discussion. She has a book called The Progress of Romance that was published at the end of 18th century. Yeah, and she addresses this question, this difference between novel and romance. She even goes back to the 14th century and analyzes some of the work of Boccaccio, for instance, to construct her argument about novel and reality and fiction. So I was just curious to know if you plan to include her in your discussion, and how do you think she can contribute to this topic, to this debate? That's it.
So, thank you, Thais. That's a very interesting question, and don't stop asking those questions. And I would say the first that scene of that he saw the Vendôme column and the square. I would describe it as impressionist in a way because it's a fleeting image, but I wouldn't think the other ones were impressionists. They're more like cubists in a way because you see both things and you don't know exactly what the hell is that. Yeah, they're both sides of his uncle. Is his uncle a captain, or his uncle is something more, or he was going to or coming from? So it's not really impressionist. It's a very completely different kind of description, I would say. This cubism, it's of course it's far-fetched, but I don't know. It's just what came to me when you asked the question. But it's something more. It's not impressionism, but in some scenes, in some ways, could be. Thinking about impressionism as something that is no longer like the avant-garde when James wrote this Small Boy and Others. That was 1870s when it started, I think. But it's a very good question. I will think about that.
Thank you, Thais. I was not planning to do it, but now I am. We were talking about this book at lunch, and now you mentioned it, so now I'm planning to do it. Yeah, it's a sign. I cannot say much about it now, but the next time we meet, I hope I will have something to say. But no, just I think it's the evolution of the novel, of the genre, the relationship between novel and romance, and the way they represent reality or the place of verisimilitude in each of these genres. It's a subject that interests me very much. I'm mostly interested in this status of fiction in its relation to truth and lie. So I think there is historical moments when the fiction, the term fiction, the concept of fiction is being conceptualized. And there is the moment I told about today through the work of Catherine Gallagher. But I think I like very much the work of Jacinto Lins Brandão, and the way he studies the moment when, for him, the romance is emerging. There is no, the term romance didn't exist already, because for him there is a Greek romance in the second and third century of our era. So this is a moment, he says, when the fiction is being conceptualized for the first form. He says Aristotle constructed a theory of mimesis, but he did not construct a theory of fiction. And Luciano de Samosata is for the first time constructing a theory of fiction, conceptualizing fiction and saying fiction is absolutely free. He doesn't use the word fiction, he uses the Greek word pseudo. But poetry and pseudo. Poetry is pseudo, and in the sense that it's free from philosophical truth, it's free from historical truth, but it's not a lie. It's the other of truth. And it's also free from verisimilitude, because Aristotle links poetry and verisimilitude. For Lucian, poetry is free from verisimilitude. It's the first moment when the fiction is being conceptualized, and it's the moment of the emergence of this new genre, the romance. Then again in the 18th century, in the moment of the emergence of the novel, fiction is again being conceptualized, and in a way that it's again linked with verisimilitude, but it's realist verisimilitude. So I'm interested in this. I hope Clara Reeve can help me with that. A invenção do romance.
Do you have more questions? Okay, so as we conclude, I would like to once again thank the speakers, Marcelo and Luiza, the audience joining us, and the Henry James Research Center, the Laboratory for the Study of the Novel, CAPS, the Graduate Program, and the Department of Literary Theory and Comparative Literature for their support in making this event possible. Thank you all very much. We will now continue with the program. The next session will be the closing keynote at 4:30 p.m. with Paulo Henriques Brito. And his talk is entitled The Role of Absence in Henry James's Fiction. Thank you all.